Greetings to you on our channel. Today we peel back the layers of a term that has become a weapon in the global theater of public opinion. We are venturing into the heart of a linguistic and historical labyrinth to address a claim that echoes through the halls of the United Nations and the streets of every major capital. The assertion that Israel is an occupier of Arab Palestine. We will meticulously examine the archives, the forgotten treaties, and the cold, hard logic of international law from the early 20th century to the pivotal year of 1964. We will investigate whether a nation can truly be an intruder in the very soil that holds the dust of its ancestors, and how a political identity was forged to challenge the legitimacy of the Jewish state. This is an inquiry into the intersection of myth, memory, and the sovereign right to exist. So, let us begin. The evening air in London during the summer of 1922 was heavy with more than just the usual dampness of the Thames. Inside the corridors of the British National Archives at Kew, today's researchers find the traces of a world being rebuilt from the ashes of the Great War. One particular set of documents, filed under the Foreign Office records, specifically FO 371, reveals the meticulous drafting of what would become the Mandate for Palestine. It was a time of ink-stained fingers and heavy parchment, where the stroke of a pen could redefine the borders of the Levant. A young clerk, working late under the dim glow of a desk lamp, might have noticed the specific language being utilized. The text did not speak of a pre-existing Arab state. Instead, it spoke of the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. The word reconstituting was not chosen by accident. It was a legal acknowledgement of an ancient presence, a bridge across 2 millennia of exile. In those quiet rooms, the weight of history felt tangible. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed, leaving behind a vast expanse of land that had no sovereign owner in the modern sense. It was a mosaic of administrative districts, none of which were named Palestine by the Turks. For 400 years, the region had been a collection of sanjaks governed from Constantinople. When the British took the reins, they were not seizing a country from a defined nation. They were administering a territory that had been, in the eyes of international law, a legal vacuum. The archives show that the League of Nations, representing the global community of the time, unanimously endorsed the British mandate. This was the highest form of international legitimacy available. The mandate specifically tasked the British with facilitating Jewish immigration and encouraging close settlement by Jews on the land. There was no mention of a Palestinian people as a distinct national entity at that time, for the very good reason that such an identity had not yet been articulated in the political sense. Across the Mediterranean, the sun beat down on the limestone hills of Judea. A Jewish surveyor, perhaps a man who had fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe, stood on a ridge overlooking the Jezreel Valley. In his leather satchel, he carried maps that were often blank in the spaces between small, scattered villages. He saw a land that was largely desolate, plagued by malaria in the swamps and erosion on the hillsides. The internal monologues of these early pioneers, recorded in crumbling diaries now held in the Zionist archives, do not speak of conquest. They speak of purchase. They speak of the exhausting process of buying land, often at exorbitant prices, from absentee effendi landlords living in Beirut or Damascus. Every dunam of soil was paid for in gold and sweat. There were no tanks, no armies of invasion, only the steady, quiet arrival of a people returning to a home they had never forgotten in their prayers. The year 1919 saw a moment of profound, though often overlooked, possibility. In the records of the Paris Peace Conference, there is a document signed by the Emir Faisal, the leader of the Arab national movement, and Weizmann. Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, was a man of vision who sought a grand Arab renaissance. In their agreement, Faisal explicitly welcomed the Jews to Palestine, recognizing the kinship between the two Semitic peoples. He wrote that the Arabs and Jews would work together for the development of the Near East. His internal thoughts, reflected in his correspondence with British officials, suggested a belief that Jewish intelligence, capital, and energy would be the engine that lifted the entire region out of its medieval slumber. For a brief window in time, the leaders of both movements saw their aspirations not as a zero-sum game, but as a partnership. The dream of an Arab kingdom in Syria and Iraq was seen as perfectly compatible with a Jewish homeland in Palestine. However, the political winds shifted. The French ousted Faisal from Damascus, and the Arab nationalist movement began to look for new targets. In the narrow alleys of Jerusalem, a different narrative began to take root. It was here that the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, began to weave a tapestry of religious and ethnic opposition. The British archives in Jerusalem, the records of the High Commissioner's office, document the rising tide of incitement. Al-Husseini did not argue for a Palestinian state in the modern sense. His rhetoric was pan-Islamic and pan-Arab. He sought to maintain the feudal power structures of the elite families against the modernizing influence of the Jewish pioneers. The clashes of the 1920s and 30s were not the struggles of a displaced nation, but the violent reaction of a traditional society to a perceived threat to its religious hegemony. By 1947, the British were exhausted. The empire was receding, and the problem of Palestine was handed to the newly formed United Nations. The halls of the General Assembly in New York were filled with the smoke of 1,000 cigarettes as diplomats debated the Partition plan. Resolution 181 proposed the division of the land into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. The Jewish leadership, despite the agonizingly small and fragmented territory offered to them, accepted the plan. They were willing to compromise, to take any sliver of sovereignty that would allow them to protect their survivors after the horrors of the Holocaust. But the Arab leadership, both within Palestine and in the surrounding capitals, rejected the plan out of hand. They did not want a state alongside Israel. They wanted the absence of Israel. On May 14, 1948, as the last British soldiers marched toward the docks of Haifa, David Ben-Gurion stood beneath a portrait of Theodor Herzl in the Tel Aviv Museum. His voice, thin but resolute, broadcast the Declaration of Independence. He spoke of the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate. As he spoke, the sound of distant explosions could already be heard. 5 Arab armies, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, began their march. Their goal was not to establish a state for the local Arabs. It was to carve up the territory for themselves. The historical records of the 1948 war, including the diaries of Arab officers found in captured headquarters, reveal a startling truth. There was no plan among the invading armies to create an independent Palestine. The Jordanians wanted Jerusalem and the West Bank for the Hashemite crown. The Egyptians wanted the Gaza Strip. The local Arab population was seen as a pawn in a larger game of regional power. The fog of war in 1948 obscured a legal reality that remains crucial. When the smoke cleared, Jordan had occupied Judea and Samaria, the land they renamed the West Bank. Egypt had occupied the Gaza Strip. For 19 years, from 1948 to 1967, these territories were under Arab control. During those 2 decades, there was no movement to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank or Gaza. No one called for liberation from Jordan or Egypt. The international community, including the Arab League, did not demand the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian entity in those lands. The silence of those 19 years is one of the most profound witnesses in the archive of history. It suggests that the Occupier label was not born of a desire for national self-determination, but was a political construct waiting for its moment to be deployed. In the early 1960s, the atmosphere in Cairo and Damascus was electric with the fever of Pan-Arabism. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president, looked for a way to unite the Arab world under his leadership. It was in this crucible of regional rivalry that the Palestine Liberation Organization was born in 1964. The original charter of the PLO, drafted in Cairo, contained a remarkable clause that is often scrubbed from modern textbooks. Article 24 of the 1964 Charter explicitly stated that the PLO does not exercise any territorial sovereignty over the West Bank in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, on the Gaza Strip, or in the Hema area. At its inception, the PLO was not claiming the land that is today called occupied. It was claiming the land of the State of Israel itself. The goal was not the creation of a new state, but the destruction of an existing one. The transformation of the narrative began in earnest after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel, in a desperate act of self-defense against a looming genocidal threat, pushed the Jordanian and Egyptian armies back. It found itself in control of the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria. Suddenly, the land that had been Jordanian for 19 years was redefined. The Soviet Union, seeking to undermine Western influence in the Middle East, saw an opportunity to apply the language of anti-colonialism to the conflict. Their propaganda machine, working in tandem with the intelligence services of the Eastern Bloc, began to distribute manuals on how to frame the Jewish state as a colonialist occupier. This was a masterclass in psychological warfare. By redefining the indigenous people of the land as foreign invaders, they turned history on its head. Deep in the archives of the KGB, researchers have found evidence of Operation SIG, a campaign designed to Zionize the image of Israel's enemies as oppressed victims and delegitimize the Jewish state. The Soviets understood that in the modern era, the battle for territory is won or lost in the arena of perception. They helped craft a new identity for the local Arab population, one that utilized the language of national liberation movements popular in Africa and Asia. The term Palestinian, which had previously referred to both Jews and Arabs living in the British Mandate, was now exclusively claimed by one side. The Jewish Palestinian became the Zionist occupier, and the Arab resident became the indigenous Palestinian. This linguistic shift was as effective as any division of tanks. An elderly diplomat who had served in the corridors of the UN during the late 60s once recalled in his memoirs the speed at which this new vocabulary took hold. He described meetings where the historical context of the 1922 Mandate was simply ignored, as if the world had collectively decided to erase the legal foundations of the previous 50 years. He watched as the term Occupier was repeated so often that it became a self-evident truth, requiring no further proof. The complexity of the land's history, the Jewish presence that had never truly ceased, the legal purchase of land, the rejection of partition by the Arabs, was buried under the weight of a new, simplified morality play. The physical landscape of the land of Israel tells a story that the archives only hint at. In the caves of Qumran, in the ruins of Masada, and in the very stones of the Western Wall, the archaeological record provides a silent but irrefutable testimony. Every coin pulled from the dust, stamped with ancient Hebrew letters, every ritual bath found in the hills of Hebron, speaks to a continuity that predates the very concept of the modern nation-state. These are not the artifacts of an quote, 23, They are the foundations of a home. To call a people an occupier in their own ancestral hearth is a paradox that defies both logic and history. It is akin to calling the Greeks occupiers in Athens or the Italians occupiers in Rome. The internal monologues of the Israeli leadership in 1967, as they stood at the newly liberated Western Wall, were not filled with the triumphalism of conquerors. They were filled with the awe of a people who had returned to a place that had lived in their collective memory for 70 generations. There was a sense of profound responsibility, a knowledge that they were now the custodians of a history that the world was beginning to try to erase. They looked at the maps of the 1949 armistice lines, the quote, 24, as Abba Eban called them, and knew that returning to those vulnerable lines would be a betrayal of future generations. They were not seeking to occupy another people. They were seeking to ensure that their own people would never again be threatened with annihilation. Yet the world was moving in a different direction. The oil crisis of the 1970s gave the Arab states immense leverage over the Western world. In the smoke-filled rooms of European ministries, the narrative of the quote, 25 was traded for a steady flow of crude oil. The historical facts were inconvenient, and so they were sidelined. The British documents, the League of Nations mandates, the Faisal-Weizmann agreement, all were relegated to the dusty corners of academia, while the vibrant, televised protest of the PLO took center stage. The truth was becoming a casualty of geopolitical necessity. The reality of the term Palestine itself is a study in historical irony. The name was imposed by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, specifically to erase the Jewish connection to the land of Judea. They named it after the Philistines, an extinct seafaring people from the Aegean, as a final insult to the conquered Jews. For centuries, the name was a geographic label used by outsiders, not a national designation used by the inhabitants. Even in the early 20th century, Arab leaders frequently protested the use of the name Palestine, preferring southern Syria. They understood that to accept the name Palestine was to accept a Western colonial imposition. It was only when they realized that the name could be used as a weapon against Jewish sovereignty that they embraced it as a national identity. This reinvention of history was not a grassroots movement. It was a top-down political strategy. The archives of the Arab League reveal the discussions where the Palestinian cause was identified as the most effective tool for mobilizing the Arab masses and gaining international sympathy. It was a way to redirect domestic frustration away from autocratic regimes and toward a common external enemy. The individual Arab living in Nablus or Gaza was often a pawn in this grand strategy, his own history and well-being sacrificed for the sake of a larger ideological battle. The tragedy of the conflict is not just the clash of two peoples, but the deliberate manipulation of one people's identity to destroy another's. As the decades passed, the Occupier myth became institutionalized. It was taught in universities, written into school curricula, and passed as fact in countless UN resolutions. The sheer volume of the repetition gave it a gravity that was hard to resist. Even within Israel, a younger generation, distant from the founding struggles of 1948, began to internalize some of the language of their critics. They began to question the legitimacy of their own presence in parts of their homeland, unaware that the very ground they stood on had been legally recognized as theirs by the international community long before the term occupier was ever applied to them. The documents from the British Foreign Office in the late 1930s provide a chilling foreshadowing of this development. There are reports of meetings with Arab leaders who openly admitted that their opposition to the Jewish home was not based on land or rights, but on the refusal to accept any non-Muslim sovereignty in the Middle East. One report describes a conversation with a prominent notable who laughed at the idea of a Palestinian nation, calling it a political myth for the consumption of the British. These documents, hidden for decades under secrecy laws, suggest that the architects of the narrative knew exactly what they were doing. They were creating a story that would eventually eclipse the truth. In the silence of the archives, one can almost hear the rustle of the maps being redrawn. The ink of the 1922 mandate is still there. The signatures of the world leaders are still clear, but the world has looked away. The claim of occupation rests on the assumption that there was a sovereign state of Palestine that was invaded and suppressed. But history, in its cold and uncompromising way, shows that no such state ever existed. There was a Turkish province, a British mandate, and a proposed partition that was rejected by those who now claim its benefits. The occupation is not of a country, but of a narrative. As the evening sun sets over the Judean desert, casting long, purple shadows across the wadis, the landscape remains unchanged. The stones do not lie. They tell of a people who were driven out and who returned, of a land that waited for them to bloom again, and of a world that found the truth too complicated to defend. The battle is no longer just on the borders. It is in the very definition of words. To understand the present, one must be willing to dig through the layers of propaganda and find the bedrock of documented fact. The truth about the occupier myth is buried deep beneath decades of political convenience and the loud, clamorous noise of the present. The folders in the archives are thick, filled with the correspondence of men who are long dead, yet whose decisions continue to shape the lives of millions. There are telegrams from 1948 where Arab leaders promised their people that the war would be over in days and the Jews would be driven into the sea. There are maps from 1967 showing the narrow, indefensible waste of Israel, a mere 9 miles wide at its center. These are the artifacts of a reality that the modern world prefers to forget. The narrative of the occupier requires the forgetting of these facts. It requires a collective amnesia about the context of the conflict and the legal foundations of the state. In the halls of power, the truth is often whatever can be sustained by the loudest voices. But in the quiet of the library, the documents remain. They wait for someone to turn the page, to read the fine print of the treaties, and to recognize the pattern of the deception. The story of the Occupier is a testament to the power of a well-crafted lie, but it is also a reminder that history has a way of outlasting those who try to rewrite it. The archives did not just hold paper. They hold the keys to understanding a conflict that has been distorted beyond recognition. The shadow of the Occupier label hangs over every diplomatic negotiation and every news broadcast. It is a weight that the State of Israel carries, a burden imposed by a world that has largely forgotten the history it once helped to write. But as we look closer at the documents from 1922, 1948, and 1964, we see the cracks in the narrative. We see the moments where the story was intentionally changed, where the facts were swapped for slogans. The question remains, what happens when the world is finally forced to confront the documents it has spent decades trying to ignore? There is a certain irony in the fact that the very organizations that claim to speak for the occupied were formed when there was no occupation to speak of. Their existence predates the capture of the territories they now claim. This single fact, recorded in the founding documents of the PLO, is perhaps the most dangerous truth of all. It suggests that the conflict is not about borders or settlements or even a specific piece of land. It suggests that the conflict is about the very existence of a Jewish state, in any borders, on any part of its ancestral home. The narrative of the occupier is the mask that hides this deeper, more unsettling reality. The scent of old paper and the cool air of the archive room feel like a sanctuary from the heat of the modern debate. Here, the voices of the past are preserved in their original form, unedited by the demands of 24-hour news cycles. We find letters from ordinary people, Arab and Jewish, who once lived side by side before the architects of the narrative began their work. Their stories remind us that the occupier myth has victims on both sides, the Jews whose right to their home is denied, and the Arabs whose future is held hostage to a political goal that prioritizes the destruction of Israel over the building of a prosperous life. The documents suggest a different path was possible, one that was briefly glimpsed in 1919 and 1947. It was a path of mutual recognition and compromise. But that path was blocked by those who saw more power in grievance than in peace. The occupier narrative was the wall they built to keep the two peoples apart. It is a wall made of words, of distorted history, and of a refusal to acknowledge the legal and historical rights of the Jewish people. As we continue to trace the origin of this narrative, we find ourselves following a trail that leads into the darkest corners of 20th century politics, where truth was sacrificed on the altar of ideology. The mystery of how a lie becomes a global truth is one that continues to haunt the study of history. It requires a combination of political will, a compliant media, and a general public that is too busy to check the facts. The occupier myth had all three. It was a narrative perfectly suited for its time, a tool that could be used by empires and activists alike. But the archives, for all their silence, are a patient witness. They do not change with the fashion of the day. They remain a silent challenge to those who would build their house on a foundation of myths. In a small, windowless office in Jerusalem, a researcher might be looking at a map from the 19th century. It is a map drawn by European explorers who came to the Holy Land to find the places described in the Bible. On their maps, the names they write are Bethlehem, Hebron, Nazareth, and Jerusalem. They do not write Palestine as a country, but as a region, a place of memory and pilgrimage. They note the small Jewish communities that have lived in these cities for centuries, survivors of empires and persecutions. These explorers, who had no political agenda, saw what was there, a land waiting for its people to return. Their records are another layer of evidence, another piece of the puzzle that the Occupier narrative tries to hide. The deeper one goes into the records, the more one realizes that the term Occupier is not a legal description, but a psychological one. It is designed to evoke a feeling of injustice, to bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the emotions. It is a word that shuts down conversation and ends debate. If someone is an occupier, they have no rights, no history, and no claim to the truth. That is why the term is so heavily used. It is a way to make the Jewish state an outlaw in the family of nations, regardless of the law or the history that supports its existence. The archives of the British Mandate are not just historical curiosities. They are the title deeds of a nation. They record the moment when the world recognized that the Jewish people were not strangers in the land of Israel, but its returning children. To call them occupiers is to deny the very documents that the international community itself created. It is a betrayal of the legal order that the world claimed to build after the world wars. As we look at the yellowed pages and the faded ink, we are looking at the truth that the narrative of occupation was designed to bury. And yet some documents remained hidden for a reason. Their content so explosive that they could shatter the very foundation of the modern Middle East discourse. The explosive documents buried within the restricted sections of the world's archives suggest that the narrative of quote, 54 was not a spontaneous cry for justice, but a meticulously engineered political weapon. As the dust settled on the 1967 war, a new front opened, not of tanks and jets, but of ink, airwaves, and the slow, grinding machinery of international perception. The transition from the legal reality of 1922 to the propaganda-driven reality of the 1970s required a systematic erasure of history, a process that was observed by those working in the shadows of diplomacy and intelligence. In the quiet corridors of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a senior archivist, a man who had seen the birth of the state from the inside, began to notice a disturbing trend in the incoming telegrams from European capitals. The language was shifting. The quote 55 quote were becoming quote 56 quote, and the historical context of the Jordanian annexation was being scrubbed from the official record as if it had never occurred. The transition was not accidental. In the cold, sterile offices of the KGB's first chief directorate in Moscow, the strategy for what would become, quote, 57, quote, was being refined. General Alexander Sakharovsky, the head of Soviet foreign intelligence, famously remarked that in the world of the 20th century, terrorism and disinformation were more effective than conventional warfare. The Soviet aim was to turn the Middle East into a quagmire for the West, and the Jewish state was the perfect target. By framing Israel as a, quote, 58, and the local Arab population as, quote, 59, the Soviets could mobilize the global left and the burgeoning Third World movements against the United States' primary ally in the region. The archives of the Securitate, the Romanian secret police, later revealed through the testimony of General Ion Mihai Pacepa, the highest-ranking intelligence officer to ever defect from the Eastern Bloc, that the Palestine Liberation Organization was essentially a Soviet creation. Pacepa's accounts describe secret meetings in the late 1960s where Arafat was coached by KGB experts on how to adapt his rhetoric. He was told to stop talking about the destruction of Israel and start talking about national liberation and human rights. The goal was to make the Palestinian cause palatable to a Western audience that was increasingly skeptical of traditional power politics. The internal monologues of these Soviet strategists, reconstructed from their directives and reports, reveal a cynical brilliance. They understood that the Western mind was susceptible to the narrative of the underdog. If they could successfully cast the ancient people of the land as foreign occupiers, they could delegitimize the very existence of Israel without ever having to win a battle on the ground. The driver of a Soviet embassy vehicle in Beirut during those years might have seen the constant stream of advisors and journalists who were in fact intelligence officers, all working to synchronize this new global narrative. As this propaganda machine gathered steam, the legal reality on the ground in Judea and Samaria was being documented by Israeli officials who found themselves in a unique historical position. They were not entering a foreign country. They were returning to the heartland of their own history. An Israeli civil administrator tasked with overseeing the civilian infrastructure in the hills of Samaria in 1968 recorded in his private journals the strange sensation of seeing the ruins of ancient Jewish villages appearing from beneath the modern Arab ones. He saw the remains of wine presses, the foundations of synagogues, and the mikvaot, ritual baths, that dated back to the Second Temple period. These were not the artifacts of a people who had just arrived. They were the silent witnesses to a continuity that had been suppressed by centuries of foreign rule. To him, the term occupier felt like a surreal joke, a linguistic inversion that ignored the very stones beneath his feet. The international legal debate centered on the interpretation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, passed in November 1967. The drafting of this resolution was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity, but the archives of the British and American delegations reveal the specific intent behind the wording. Lord Caradon, the British ambassador to the UN who drafted the text, intentionally omitted the word "the" before territories in the clause regarding Israeli withdrawal. This was not a grammatical oversight. It was a recognition that Israel was not expected to withdraw to the indefensible 1949 armistice lines, which were never intended to be permanent borders. The American Undersecretary of State, Eugene Rostow, a brilliant legal scholar, argued that the Jewish right of settlement in the Mandate territory had never been terminated. In his internal memos filed in the State Department archives, Rostow maintained that Israel had a better claim to the land than any other entity, as the previous occupiers, Jordan and Egypt, had seized the land through an act of aggression in 1948. Yet the legal nuance of Resolution 242 was quickly drowned out by the rising tide of the occupation myth. In the mid-1970s, the United Nations General Assembly, dominated by the Soviet Arab bloc, began passing a series of resolutions that effectively redefined the conflict. The most infamous of these was Resolution 3379, which equated Zionism with racism. This was the pinnacle of the Soviet disinformation campaign, a moment when the international community officially endorsed the inversion of history. A young diplomat from a neutral European country, observing the vote from the gallery, later wrote in his memoirs about the palpable sense of unease he felt. He saw that truth was no longer a requirement for international law. It had been replaced by the collective will of a political bloc. The archive of the UN during this period is a record of an institution losing its moral compass, as the language of liberation was used to justify the erasure of a people's history. The quote 71 that Israel was building stood in stark contrast to this gathering darkness. While the world debated its right to exist, the small nation was turning its intellect into its greatest shield. The archives of the Weizmann Institute and the early records of the Technion show a flurry of activity in the 1970s and 80s. Israel was pioneering desalination, drip irrigation, and advanced electronics, technologies that would eventually benefit the entire world. This was the quote 72 that the subscribers of the future would come to value, the ability to not only defend the land with force, but to sustain it with genius. The internal monologue of a scientist working on the first Israeli-made computers was one of quiet defiance. He knew that the best answer to the quote 73 myth was to build a society so advanced, so vital, and so rooted in its own soil that the world could not ignore it. The archaeological excavations of the 1970s, particularly in the city of David in Jerusalem, provided a material counter-narrative to the political claims of the PLO. Professor Yigal Shiloh, leading a team of international volunteers, uncovered layers of history that stretched back 3,000 years. They found the Bulai House, containing dozens of clay seals with Hebrew names mentioned in the Bible. They found the stepped stone structure that supported the palace of the Judean kings. Every bucket of earth removed from the site was a rebuke to the idea that the Jews were, quote, 74 of Jerusalem. The archives of the Israel Antiquities Authority hold the detailed site maps and photographs of these finds, documenting a reality that no UN resolution could erase. An archaeological photographer, working in the humid heat of the tunnels, captured images of inscriptions that hadn't been seen by human eyes since the Babylonian conquest. These images are the silent deeds of ownership, written in stone. However, the power of the myth lay in its ability to adapt. When the colonialist narrative began to lose its luster, it was replaced by the indigenous narrative. The Arab leadership, with the help of Western academics, began to claim that they were the descendants of the ancient Canaanites, effectively trying to leapfrog over the entire Jewish history of the land. This was a desperate attempt to create a historical pedigree where none existed in the records. The genetic studies and historical documents from the Ottoman period, preserved in the archives in Ankara, show a different story. They record the movement of tribes from across the Arab world, from Egypt, Syria, the Hejaz, and North Africa, into Palestine during the 19th and early 20th centuries, attracted by the economic opportunities created by Jewish and European investment. The indigenous claim was a modern construct, designed to compete with the undeniable Jewish connection to the land. A doctor working in a clinic in the Galilee in the late 1980s once recalled a conversation with an elderly Arab patient. The man, whose family had come from Egypt during the time of Ibrahim Pasha in the 1830s, spoke openly about his family's history. He did not call himself a, quote, 78 in the national sense. He was a member of a specific clan with roots in the Nile Delta. He remembered a time when the Jews were seen as a source of medicine, work, and progress. But his children and grandchildren had been taught a different story in the schools funded by international organizations. They had been taught that they were the victims of a, quote, 79, a catastrophe, and that the Jews were foreign invaders. The doctor watched as a shared reality was replaced by a manufactured one, fueled by a grievance that was nurtured by political leaders who benefited from perpetual conflict. The archives of the Israeli intelligence services from the 1990s, some of which have only recently been declassified, reveal the extent to which the Palestinian Authority, established after the Oslo Accords, continued the Soviet tradition of institutionalized incitement. The textbooks, the media broadcasts, and the official speeches were all designed to reinforce the __, quote, _, 80 _ myth from a young age. The goal was to ensure that even if a political agreement was reached, the ideological war would continue. The internal monologues of the Israeli negotiators during those years reflect a growing sense of betrayal. They realized that they were negotiating with a partner that was telling its own people, in Arabic, that the entire project was merely a, quote, 81, to eventually dismantle the Jewish state. The, quote, 82 of the peace process was being undermined by the, quote, 83 of the narrative. The persistence of the, quote, 84 label into the 21st century is a testament to the longevity of the Soviet-engineered disinformation campaign. It has become a staple of the global media diet, a shortcut for understanding a complex conflict without having to engage with the actual history. The terminology has been expanded to include words like __, quote, _, 85 __, and __, quote, _, 86 __, further intensifying the emotional weight of the claim while drifting even further from the factual reality. The archives of the Israeli Ministry of Justice, specifically the departments dealing with international law, contain thousands of pages of rebuttals and legal briefs that are rarely seen by the general public. These documents painstakingly dismantle the false analogies and legal distortions, but they struggle to compete with the visceral power of a 30-second news clip or a viral social media post. The __, quote, _, 87 __, concept is perhaps the ultimate answer to the, quote, 88 myth. By focusing on innovation, defense, and the resilience of its people, Israel demonstrates that its presence in the land is not a temporary intrusion, but a permanent and vital restoration. The archives of the startup nation, the patent filings, the venture capital records, the blueprints for cyber defense systems, are the modern equivalent of the ancient seals found in the city of David. They are proof of a people who have not only returned to their home, but are actively shaping the future of humanity from that home. The intellect that protects Israel is the same intellect that refuses to be defined by a narrative created by its enemies. The influence of these myths on the modern world is profound. They have shaped the policies of nations, the curricula of universities, and the opinions of millions who have never set foot in the Middle East. They have created a world where a Jewish student in London or New York is told that they are a, quote, 89 because of their connection to a land that their ancestors never forgot. This is the psychological success of the narrative, the ability to make a people feel like strangers in their own identity. The archives, however, offer a way back. They provide the evidence that can pierce through the fog of propaganda and remind the world of the legal and historical foundations of the Jewish state. The fate of the witnesses to the truth is often a quiet one. The archivists, the surveyors, the archaeologists, and the soldiers who saw the reality on the ground have mostly faded into the background of history. Their diaries and reports are filed away in acid-free folders, waiting for a generation that is willing to look past the slogans. Some of the documents have been lost to fire or neglect, but the core of the record remains intact. It is a record of a legal process that was followed, a land that was purchased, a desert that was made to bloom, and a people who defended their right to live in peace against overwhelming odds. The _quote_90__ is not hidden. It is simply ignored by those who find it inconvenient. The documents suggest that the _quote_91__ is indeed dangerous, not because it is a secret, but because it challenges the power structures that have been built on the foundation of the _quote_92__ myth. To acknowledge the historical and legal reality of Israel's presence in the land is to admit that much of the international discourse of the last 50 years has been based on a falsehood. It is to acknowledge the role of the Soviet Union in engineering a conflict that has claimed so many lives. It is to recognize that the Palestinian cause has often been used as a tool by those who care little for the welfare of the people they claim to represent. This is a truth that many in the halls of power are not yet ready to hear. As we look at the contemporary world, we see the results of this long-term ideological campaign. The Occupier myth has been integrated into the intersectional movements of the West, linking the struggle against the Jewish state with unrelated social and political causes. This has created a global front against Israel that is largely immune to historical facts or legal arguments. The battle for the future is not just about security on the borders, but about the integrity of history itself. If the Occupier myth is allowed to stand unchallenged, it sets a precedent where any nation's history can be rewritten to suit the political needs of the moment. The story of the __quote_97__ myth is a warning about the power of language and the vulnerability of truth in the face of persistent propaganda. It is a reminder that a nation's most important defense is not just its army, but its memory. For the Jewish people, who have survived by the power of their memory for 2,000 years, the challenge of the 21st century is to ensure that their true history is not buried under the weight of a manufactured one. The archives are the reservoir of that memory, the place where the facts are preserved until the world is ready to see them again. The sun begins to set over the Mediterranean, reflecting off the glass towers of Tel Aviv, the city built on sand dunes that were legally purchased a century ago. Below the surface of this modern metropolis, and in the ancient hills to the east, the layers of history remain. The documents in the archives at Kew, the records in the basement of the UN, and the stone inscriptions in the city of David all point to the same reality. The Jewish state is not an intruder in the land. It is the land's most enduring and legitimate sovereign. The myth of the __quote_98__ is a shadow that is long, but it has no substance of its own. It is a shadow cast by a sun that is setting on the era of disinformation. In a small room in the National Library, an old folder is being closed. The paper is brittle, the edges slightly charred from a fire that occurred during a long-forgotten riot. On the final page, there is a handwritten note from a British official in 1947 expressing his exhaustion with the, quote, 99 of the region. He concludes with a single prophetic sentence, quote, 100. This note, unsigned and unofficial, remains one of the few honest assessments in the entire collection. The truth is there, etched into the very fabric of the history we have explored, waiting for those with the courage to read the fine print. The investigation into the archives of the 20th century reveals a pattern of deliberate manipulation, but it also reveals a resilience that is uniquely Israeli. The ability to build a flourishing democratic society in the face of such a global campaign of delegitimization is perhaps the greatest achievement of the Zionist movement. It is a testament to the fact that while myths can be powerful, they cannot indefinitely suppress the reality of a people's connection to their home. The Occupier myth will eventually crumble under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving behind the solid bedrock of historical fact. As the archivist turns off the light in the research room, the silence is profound. The millions of pages of documents, the treaties, the telegrams, the maps, and the diaries sit in the dark, their information preserved for the next seeker of truth. They do not need to shout to be heard. They only need to exist. The reality of the Jewish state's legitimacy is not a matter of opinion, but a matter of record. It is a record that begins in the ancient world, is reaffirmed by the modern international community, and is sustained by the sweat and intellect of every generation that has returned to its soil. The last document in the folder is a small black and white photograph of a Jewish family standing in front of their new home in a village in the Judean hills, dated 1924. They are smiling, despite the harsh conditions and the uncertainty of the future. In their eyes, there is no sense of being occupiers. There is only the profound, quiet relief of being home. This image, more than any legal brief or propaganda poster, captures the essence of the truth that the world has tried so hard to forget. It is the truth that the State of Israel was built not on conquest, but on the return of a people to the place where their story began. The shadow of the myth remains, but the light of the archive is stronger. The documents have spoken, the stones have testified, and the logic of history has been laid bare. The question of whether Israel is an occupier has been answered, not by rhetoric, but by the cold, hard evidence of the past. The truth is indeed dangerous to those who rely on lies, but for those who value the integrity of history, it is the only foundation upon which a lasting future can be built. In the heart of the library, the last shelf is filled with the unread volumes of a history that is still being written, a history of a people who refuse to be erased from their own land. Inside the thick gray folder labeled FO371/9254, there is a single overlooked receipt for the purchase of land near the ancient city of Shiloh, dated 1908.